Hi, I was given this plot because I'm short, so you can see me now. So, first of all, thank you so much for your invitation. I'm just delighted we can talk about translation to our heart's content in this lovely little resort town in Italy for 2 weeks. It's just such a luxury. So thank you. Really like to express my gratitude. So in my session, I'm going to talk about technology and that impact on translation and bring that back to the implications for pedagogy. Because right now, as I speak, we are rolling out a new set of qualifications at Auckland. So I've been very busy, and a lot of things Dorothy was talking about yesterday really struck the chord. And the things that I have to think about. How can we be a step ahead of the trend? I mean, university tends to be other way around. You know, because of bureaucracy, red tape, it takes ever longer to introduce anything. You know, it takes 2 years, you know, before you can introduce anything. So it's been a challenge. But we are able to do some interesting, we think, is innovative things. But today I may not have much time to talk about that aspect. And today I'm going to talk about augmented reality. So who knows what augmented reality means? Great. Okay. You must have played Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go is a very good example of augmented reality. So augmented reality means that virtual object is overlaid within your real environment. So in fact, if you're walking around with your mobile phone, you know, your GPS working, it's a bit like that, you know. So you're looking at this device, pictures on device, but you are in a real environment. Whereas virtual reality, you go into the enclosed environment. It's not, you know, overlaid with the real reality. So that's the difference. So today, I'm also using the term mixed reality. So the term mixed reality and augmented reality tend to be used interchangeably. And it's a very unstable terminology. So obviously these concepts are relatively new. Not that new, but as a commercial products, really for the last few years, we're actually seeing the products more commonly. So when I say mixed reality, I don't just mean augmented reality. I'm using it somewhat metaphorically as well, because in today's world, we have, in translation world, parallel world now developed. So for example, we have professional translation on the one hand, and we have non-professional translation on the other. Some of you might have heard of phenomenon such as fan translation done by fans of particular TV series or Japanese anime, etc. So it's almost like this parallel universe has developed. And on top of that, we're having this kind of technology to overlay this kind of virtual elements into it. So it's a very complex and interesting world technologically. So today I'm going to focus on those aspects. So as James said, I was based in Dublin for 14 years, teaching and researching at Dublin City University. Here you can see. And just as I was developing my acquired taste of Guinness, I had to leave. So that was a pity. To here in New Zealand. So this building, kind of retro-looking building, is the one that arts is housed. And do you know what this dance is? Does anyone watch rugby? New Zealand rugby team is All Blacks, and they usually perform this war dance, haka. Even Spice Girls did this. Anyway, so it's a very different environment, very South Pacific. And I'm really consciously noticing that my notion of translation is changing. It was lovely to be immersed in Eurocentric views of translation in Dublin. I say it in a very positive way, honestly. But now that I'm in New Zealand, I'm very much thinking in terms of, you know, South Pacific, Australasia. It's really interesting how where you live, where you are based, affects that notion. So again, this is my personal history. Why am I interested in technology? Well, I'm not exactly Generation Z or Generation Y or whatever, but I started to work as a translator in the early 80s at the government translation office in New Zealand. And I was recruited as a Japanese translator because New Zealand started to trade with Japan at the time. So I translated all sorts of things, commercial documents as well as government official documents. Day one, when I arrived there, I was given this tool or machine. Does anyone know what this is? This is Japanese manual typewriter. Okay? So that means we've got thousands of characters. And it's nearly impossible unless you are a trained typist, because you have to visually search each character. And I thoroughly hated it. So the tool used to slow me down. It wasn't a productivity tool at all. That was the opposite. So my mission is to help myself out of this situation. So at the time, the technology was just coming on. Even my European colleagues at the time were using electric typewriter with golf balls. I don't know if any of you know this. And then just gradually, technology started to come in, and this Macintosh arrived, and Macintosh was multilingual, and that was absolutely godsend. It was absolutely fantastic technology. So this is how I got into technology. So I decided to study this properly and went back to graduate school, and there was no department of translation studies at the time in New Zealand, so I sneaked into communications department. So in fact, I did my PhD in communications, and I almost self-taught all translation material. So, so in Dublin, I had a hard time. The learning curve was very high because I was hired as a translation studies scholar, but I was actually coming from, of course they knew I didn't lie, coming from media studies, communication studies backgrounds using technology. So that's how I'm interested in technology. And just to share the story of early days of the internet, those of you who work with Asian scripts, you know this kind of garbled message when the text go over the internet. And that was just such a terrible thing. And this happens because of this encoding issue. There were no standard methods to encode these non-European languages until the Unicode was commonly installed. And it was particularly interesting about Maori language in New Zealand, because Maori is one of the New Zealand's official languages. Two New Zealand official languages are Maori and Sign Language, New Zealand Sign Language. English is not even an official language. This is really interesting because English is the most commonly spoken language in New Zealand. Anyway, my colleagues who work with the Maori language were really fiercely in the 1990s looking for macron. Macron is this symbol above vowel. This makes it prolonged vowel, Maori language. And it wasn't available in computers. Now when you select with Microsoft New Zealand English, then you can choose Maori, and then you can press certain key with vowel, then this macron comes on top of it. But this kind of thing used to really annoy us as translators, because these accent symbols are part of the language. It's like a spelling error if you don't have it. Other people didn't understand it. Well, that's just a dot on the top of letter, but it was much more than that. So I think technology in this way is really very, very interesting. It's not something separate, because when I go to translators conferences, not so much these days, but early days, I used to have these comments, oh, I'm allergic to technology, so don't tell me about anything about technology. But in fact, it is actually very, very interesting thing to think about. Now, this is a contextual information. Last couple of years, I'm really beginning to feel AI is coming to affect us, our lives, generally. So AI stands for, of course, artificial intelligence. So this is Japanese shogi player. Shogi is Japanese chess, playing against actually computer. So this is AI shogi player. Now, this is an interesting thing that he said, the human player said. So Sato is a top champion of shogi, and he said, I look forward to the challenge of playing against AI because I can learn from how it plays and reflect back on my human way of playing. And just recently, Google's Go playing AI let loose, and they let AI play against AI. And they published which hands they used. And the professional Go players were mesmerized because they played in such different ways. And the humans said they learned from it. And I think this is a very interesting situation that we can apply to translation as well, that how computer translates, and we actually observe and learn from it in some cases. By the way, did you know that 2016, this is the very first AI-generated musical. So computer system came up with lyrics and parts of music score and wrote actually the whole plot. James's eye is widening. And so this kind of really doing creative work is now starting to happen. So in the US, there are specialized companies which train AIs to produce sports results summary. And you cannot tell it's not written by a human sports commentator. It pulls up data and put together because it's relatively formulaic. So it can put together very plausible sports results text. So it's starting to become that kind of stage where technology is doing creative kind of work, not just mundane formulaic work. And Google's AI engine is strengthening its power by reading kind of Mills and Boons. Because initially they're going to feed children's story, but they felt children's story is limited in vocabulary. And in fact, these romance novels are fantastic with adjectives, and it can learn so that the AI can have a kind of natural conversational chatbot kind of engine. And of course, machine translation system is now using AI techniques, machine learning and deep learning. So Facebook is now using it, and also Google, of course, GNMT, so Google Neural MT, which allegedly bumps up the quality by far for particularly previously very difficult language pairs, such as English and Chinese and English and Japanese. So it's an interesting word. So when I think about enlarging boundary, Maria Taimachiko and others talked about this enlarging boundary of translation. And I think of this, even Maria talked about this neuroscience, how it can, enlarge translation studies and have impact our understanding of translation process, what goes on in translators' minds. So these are my kind of map when I think about enlarging the boundary. So I'm really interested in this AI technique used in Neural MT. So that's coming from SMT, stands for Statistical MT. So Neural MT is practically SMT, but using more AI-inspired techniques such as deep learning, machine learning. And on the other hand, PT stands for Professional Translation, and also non-professional translation is developing. And to me, this is very much supported by technological infrastructure. For example, Web 2.0, that's a second generation web technology where people started to be able to actually post their own material like YouTube. So user-generated content became really a big thing. And Time magazine, chose 2006, I think, you as the person of the year, because of this active participation, which became possible thanks to the technological development. And that also impacted on translation, because now everyday person who may have had another language can act as a translator, self-proclaimed translator. And that might be through fan translation network or crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing is a made-up word coined by American journalist Jeff Howey. He published a book called Crowdsourcing, and that's a made-up word between crowd and outsource. So outsourcing means that people are paid to a task, but crowdsourcing generally speaking, not always, generally speaking, problem is spread out on the internet. Hey, we have this problem, who can help? And surprisingly, people are happy to impart, contribute their knowledge without necessarily being paid. So this form of engaging people in general who are on the internet into translation. So crowdsourcing is used in different areas, and translation is one of them. In some cases, very successful. For example, TED. Do you know TED? Yeah. That's a wonderful clips of experts in different fields talking about the areas. And they always make these video clips. And they want to spread these good ideas to people, but they realize the message stays in English. So they wanted to add subtitles. So they decided to use crowdsourcing to subtitle these TED Talks, because this whole venture is non-profit venture. So they opened up the platform, subtitling platform, and asked Frontiers. And it's been a phenomenal success. And now they have so many different languages, including minority languages. This is quite characteristic of using crowdsourcing technique, because if we left, language translation number of languages available, they tend to go for major languages. But when you open up platforms for crowdsourcing, often minority languages really get attention. And often the quality is very good, because people who participate really are very proud of their language and heritage. So they make sure the quality is very high. So all these different things ideas, coming across to translation. So for instance, at the moment, Cambridge Analytics is a bit problematic with Facebook, but basically this big data are used to understand human behavior. And I would love to apply that sort of technique to understand translators' behavior and also translation users' behavior. So this kind of some available technologies made me really want to do more empirical research, but also gaining some data, physical data, their bodily data, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And ethics is a big thing as well. Ethical questions are always big in translation and interpretation, but especially kind of in digital sphere, ethics became quite an interesting conundrum. So fan translation, as popular as it is generally speaking illegal, because fans do not gain permission from the copyright holders. They add their own subtitles, then they spray it on the internet. So strictly speaking, it's not legal, but they have their own logic to say we're not making any profit. As soon as the official version comes out, we totally close down our network, etc. So their own logic. So this ethics and legal framework kind of intertwine and getting to a very interesting stage. And also this question of who owns the content of translation memory has always been argued. Does the translator own it or your client owns it? It's not always clear. So hitting this key theme here, translation and pedagogy. This is my way of addressing this theme. So firstly, a technologically dynamic environments are a posing challenge to think about how to educate translators in the 21st century. So I talked about AI already, and also this participatory culture. Media studies scholars talk about this participatory culture unleashed because of this particular technological, unleashed because of technological environments. They can get together and work together relatively easily by using this digital environment. And this helped the visibility of various groups who may be operating as non-professional translators, for better or worse. And also another interesting angle is this social and environmental changes. So many countries are now having diversity of population or super diversity. So in New Zealand, Auckland is considered to be a city of super diversity. We have many immigrants of different nationalities, Then there's implications of how to provide public information, public service information. So community translation and interpreting is very important. And also, because of this climate change, we're having more kind of disasters and crises. Well, recent example, this is not environmental disaster, but Grenfell Tower fire. This really highlighted the importance of having plans, how to communicate to speakers of different languages when some critical incidents happen. And these things are not really well thought through at the policy level. So I'm involved in a European project to address this issue, particularly focused on translation, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and also big earthquakes. So I tend to like the countries which have earthquakes. So for example, Japan, New Zealand, both have really earthquake bound. And what happens if whole bus load of tourists are midst of this? How are you going to communicate with them? So it's a big issue. And training issue, how do we train these translators? So it really goes into community translators. So today I'm going to focus on these 4 aspects. So I constructed my talk so that I can stop at any point. So if I'm going on and on, blah, blah, please stop me, James. So I can always talk to you during tea break. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit more about fan community of translators. So in terms of the usage of terminology, very confusingly, sometimes these kinds of translation is also described as community translation. So community translation doesn't always mean public service translation, which is the case in many countries and many contexts, but it depending on the author and the context, it may mean different things. And in my case, one of my research fields is video game localization, translating video games. So I want to just talk a little bit about what's happening in that space in relation to these fan activities. And second, I want to talk about these crisis scenarios, which I mentioned very briefly as part of this European project called Interact. And then thirdly, I want to talk about human technology entanglement. So I'm using this term deliberately, which I'll explain it later, but I think now entanglement is deeper than interaction. And I think we're getting to the stage that really this interchange is becoming really at deeper level. So I'm calling it entanglement. So like Argentinian tango, kind of really, legs intertwining. So that's the kind of image I have. And here I talk about augmented reality based research that I've just recently conducted. And finally, if time allowed, I want to talk about challenges for translator education and training. So that's the plan. So first, fan community of translators in the space of video game localization. It's really interesting. Now, because of social networking, today, as soon as new video game is released by Nintendo, for example, in Japan, the fans all over the world, even before translation or localized version comes up, get to know about this. And they already start discussion about the game. And some people can understand, know Japanese, overseas fans know Japanese, so they even play the original game and report back and already start to complain about the new game, etc. And this kind of word of mouth on the internet spreads very, very quickly. In some cases, they serve to promote distrust of what official localization is doing. They very much consider anything changed as self-censorship. So adaptation is a very tricky notion under any circumstances, but in particular, video games, there are lots of adaptation being made. Because taking the example of Japanese games, there are very, very many Japanese specific elements which are just not understandable if you just translate literally. That actually is misleading. So therefore, professional game localizers, they adapt to a greater extent. But when fans find that out, they are not happy about it. They complain, we are not playing the same game as Japanese gamers play. So give us the same thing, give us the literal translation. This is not authentic. So they develop their own theory the amount of theorization fans do is just phenomenal. When you go to do an ethnography, they look at their discourse in different forums. It's just really incredible theorization are taking place, and it's such a wonderful resource for translation scholars to study this. But even within the communities of fans, there are divisive views. Some agree with this radical views and others don't. And this kind of interesting social justice warrior type of opinions come up. This new game has got a scene where the character put magic powder in somebody else's drink. This shouldn't be allowed. And big discussion happens. And there was an actual example last year that actually Nintendo was forced to explain, even before this localized version came out, how they're going to deal with this particular scene. And they decided to actually change that lacing the drink. But people don't play games to learn moral, and so it's kind of an interesting argument because of this technological setup that fans can easily talk to one another, and even fan-translated version can be trusted, and this leads to distrust of official translation. So there's a thin line between what game localizers call culturalization of games. So this is game publishers, official publishers' view that we localize, we culturalize game to suit each market. But fans or users, game users' point of view, they call this as self-censorship and kind of sanitization, etc. And this whole kind of fan movement, in some cases, going to this direction of hacker ethic. So hacker ethics is something which is behind even something like the internet, making of the internet. This spirit of sharing and distrust of centralized authority. So concepts such as open source software as opposed to proprietary software is driven by this kind of ethos. And this is now very much affecting what professional localizers should be doing. So this is a real clash between professional norms and expectancy norms. In some cases, expectancy norms really win out, and professional norms have to be modified. So because of this whole network of fans, users now so prevalent, that the situation is this. So localizers are now increasingly have to have very clear approach to localization. So when fans criticize, they have to be prepared to be able to explain why they changed the scene, why they translated this to that. Otherwise, this huge distrust develops among fans. And this is needed more than ever. So at the moment, translation quality assessment in game localization is very much dependent on so-called linguistic testing and functional testing. So that means when games were localized, then testers come along and make sure these linguistic elements are correct. Because often when translators translate games, they're given bits without context. So sometimes, the translations may not be wrong. So once translation is done, they put inside the software and compile them, and then actually game is being played and functionality is tested. But something more than this is needed. Somehow, now localization field in games really need user input early on during this process. So I was looking at any kind of theoretical framework that I can use, and I found this user-centered translation. Is anyone familiar? This is a book came out 2015 by Finnish scholars, Sojanen et al. And they very much take the quality assessment from usability point of view. So they talk about things like feedback and feed force. So, formative feedback while during this workflow of translation, and get user feedback during it and incorporate it into this circle. And really treat user opinions very, very seriously. And they call this two-directional feedback. So as I said, feedback and feed force. And this kind of approach will really suit things like video game localization, because if the gamers in the market didn't like it, then that's the end of it. So it has to be entertaining, and users are extremely important. So as I mentioned, I really wanted to understand users. So my research focus really shifted to users of translation. So I wanted to do usability studies and player experience studies. And I wanted to use some kind of sensors to do a triangulation in addition to self-reported feedback from gamers. So sometimes, when you say something, your bodily response may be saying something else. So I started to search for different types of sensors and talk to colleagues. And then, of course, eye tracking devices are very, very popular now. Have any of you used eye tracking? Oh, no? Okay. So eye tracking, these glasses here you can see, and also screen version here as well, that these track people's eyes, where the eyes are fixating, and capture visual attention. And that can tell the cognitive processing, etc. I'll talk more about it a bit later. And also I was using galvanic screen response. So this is the same logic as lie detector, captures the sweat. So basically when arousal level goes up, more sweat, and you can tell something about the state of the person, and also heart rate monitor, etc. This is screenshots from one of my PhD students who used eye tracking to understand these kind of additional texts put in. So this is an interesting example of anime DVD, Japanese anime called Pani Pony Dash. This is really outlandish kind of anime. And now this company in particular decided to use some of this fan translators' quintessential approach that is really add cultural notes. So you can choose not to have these menus, but if you had chosen cultural notes, this kind of notes come up and explain cultural objects. And some real fans of Japanese anime love to know these cultural explanations. So they add these things when they are watching the anime, and look at the results of eye tracking. So this is called heat map, and it shows the red part is a really kind of fixated areas. So the tendency of people is just eyes automatically goes to any new element when they pop out. So in the screen, when these texts come up, it immediately goes up here, right? Concentration. Whereas before, subtitle was down here, so concentration was here, and also looking at some object. So eye tracking can show you that kind of thing. But one has to be very careful. You have to always do triangulation, because this eye-mind hypothesis, when you look at something, you are not necessarily thinking about that. You might be thinking about, oh, your husband might be cooking very nice meal when you get home, by looking at something different. So you have to always ask the subject, you can play back this trajectory, eye tracking trajectory, and do retrospective interview. And you can walk through and they can explain. Sometimes they can't explain. They don't know why I was looking at that. But other cases, yeah, I was thinking about today's lunch or something. So you need to triangulate. So I was trying all these different types of data. So when I did this particular study with video game, got gamers to play different versions, localized versions of games. So when you use eye tracking, you can also capture this play trajectory, the video trajectory. And also I was using heart rate, galvanic skin response, and etc., and interview. So when you collect up these data, it's interesting. Of course, the more data are supposed to be better, but not always the case. For example, I learned this hard way myself. Galvanic skin response, this arousal level, you really have to have pretty much very strong stimuli to get this. So the video game I was using was not really strong enough. So the signal was very weak. So I really couldn't use this data very much. So and yet, takes a lot of effort to capture this, collect this data. So one has to be economical about, there's lots of resources involved. So one has to be just not do it for the sake of it. Right, changing the gear. Now I want to talk about this translation in crisis scenarios. So this is a project funded by EU, Horizon 2020, led by Dr. Sharon O'Brien from Dublin City University. And this project started last year and goes up to 2020. INTERACT stands for International Network on Crisis Translation. So this is a research network aimed to contribute to translation-enabled communication in crisis and disaster settings. And the key things that scholars already identified, Sharon's group identified, are timely, accurate, and trusted communication is needed, especially in these settings. So this is a really multifaceted, huge project involving a number of universities, and Auckland University is one of them. And my particular work package is focusing on training, and training of citizen translators. We were looking at the terminology, shall we call it community translators, but we decided to go with citizen translators. So idea is that ordinary citizens who have more than one language can be deployed when the emergency strikes. So the training of such people really pose huge challenge because they are not everyday translators. And depending on the language pairs, you know, the level of understanding of this kind of communication differs so much. I discovered a very interesting thing doing this project. So first of all, we were using one of my classes, which is community translation class at university. This is a postgraduate course. Just first 4 sessions dedicated to this topic. So 3 hours for each session, so 12 hours altogether. So these are good, you know, students with bachelor's degree. Some are new to translation studies, others have good grounding in bachelor's degree. So we've been thinking, brainstorming, what sort of good teaching method we can use. Oops, shouldn't have touched that, yeah. Okay. And we decided to use this methodology called active learning. It sounds a bit daft to say active learning, but this is a very specific method, often used secondary schools, you know, high schools and even primary schools. It's basically really means actively, physically actively involving learners. So I had a very interesting visit to this particular university in Singapore. This is a Singapore University National. This is part of the National University Network in Singapore. It's University of Design and Technology. Entire university uses active learning. First thing I noticed was their furniture. All the furniture has got wheels, so you can move around and you can configure different shapes, small groups, big groups, whiteboard, and they train students to be able to do brainstorming using whiteboard. This kind of skills. And so lecturers are very much facilitator. And this is quite challenging, you know, for us if we're used to transmissionist approach. But we decided to give a go with this approach because really topic was new to us as well. We were learning ourselves. So we configured, you know, we introduced new topic to the student and form different sized groups and group discussion, and they have to come up to the front and show what they've written on a paper and flip chart and explain this. And it was very, very effective way of engaging students. So nobody was left out, not being engaged. And also we used participatory method. We were using action research. Because a number of universities are involved in this project, we are doing iteration. So first was Auckland University, and went to University College London, and then Dublin City University, and we're coming back to Auckland again. And the type of assignments that we used in this particular session in Auckland was that we got students to actually come up with translation brief and guidelines that are usable by different communities. So they had to set up these guidelines based on particular source text that all different communities are going to translate. So these are really completely new to most students because most students may have done translation, but they've never created translation brief or guidelines. So this really stimulated different angles to look at translation, and it was very, very useful. We got very useful feedback, positive feedback from students. And also another interesting new thing we are going to do is this PFA, so that's psychological first aid training. So as you can imagine, this kind of scenario, translators go into this earthquake struck area, and some people may be traumatized. And this kind of training is really useful, just very short term, band-aid, but better than nothing. And such training is available, was made available to us because we work with New Zealand Red Cross. Sorry. Okay. All right. Okay, so from here, I have a new PhD student who is working on broadly under this topic, but she's focusing on stress of translators who work in this kind of settings. And we're trying to find some kind of useful theoretical framework, and we came upon this cognitive readiness model. So this is used by military training. So you know how the soldiers are trained, but you can't have the real situation in the training, and yet they have to be ready. So this is very much adaptive problem solving, and that is quite relevant to training of citizen translators, because earthquake doesn't strike every day, and yet you have to be trained and mentally agile to act when earthquake strikes. So we are applying this kind of framework. And here, last year we had Michael Cronin visiting us, and he was talking about echo translation, which I believe he will do next week. And in his book, one chapter is dedicated to low-tech translation. And this is very, very interesting. So this is very applicable to this kind of settings, because after the earthquake, sometimes no power, no mobile phone, no computers, and if translators can only translate using computers, they are at a loss. So we need to do high-tech training and low-tech training as well. And this actually hits a nice kind of balance, because if translators, for example, always translate with translation memory, especially new translators, then they can't almost translate without memory prompting existing translation to work with. So this is de-skilling issue is very serious concern. So we should be doing both. Sometimes pen and paper, translation. And also, in this particular case of my PhD student, she's thinking of using this role plays because quite often evacuation centers do this role play, official role play evacuation practices. So we are trying to organize for her to actually implant translators to just see how they respond. And we are looking into augmented reality and virtual reality to induce kind of simulated situation. So here, do I have time, James?
Oh, yes.
Yeah? I want to talk about my another project, which involves augmented reality. So this is a conference I went last year in Wellington in New Zealand, and it's happening right now again in New Zealand. So in this conference last year, I really was convinced that this technology is now at consumer level technology. So first of all, gamers already use this VR headset to really get into immersive situation. And also, many government departments are using this kind of techniques. So for example, Wellington in New Zealand is very much earthquake-bound city. So Wellington City Council decided to develop a simulation of earthquakes and system where when earthquake hits, that they can actually observe, survey the areas, affected areas, wearing goggles and do virtual walkthrough. So city councils can do virtual walkthrough. So this kind of technology is coming through. And if you're a sports fanatic and you already know the sports gym, they use kind of virtual reality. If you're going on a treadmill, you have nice videos and so forth. So sports gyms is another big example, is really interested in this kind of technology, augmented reality, etc. And I think translation has a place for this. Now this comes from Guardian's December edition 2015. This was happening in France. So they wanted to develop the smart glasses which interact with mobile app to show subtitles for French language entertainment. So when tourists come without French, they can just don the smart glasses and they can see subtitles displayed. And this has been tried in different places of the world, and I tried one in Japan as well. And it's amazing. So initially it takes a bit of getting used to that, but once you get used to it, it's really very effective to have actually subtitles coming right under your eyes. So this kind of use of augmented reality is more and more becoming common, and this interesting project is happening in the UK. The National Theatre is trying out, again, similar idea, smart glasses. So in this case, they're working on accessibility mode. So people with hearing impairments or deaf audience can go in and again don these glasses, and they can see subtitles done in real time. And it's still very experimental, but we are coming to that stage where these technologies are coming on. So I wanted to do something related to that. So last year I had a relatively small seed funding from my university to encourage interfaculty research. So I teamed up with science guys and put together this project called Captions on the holodeck, and used augmented reality technology to project captions of recorded lectures for hard of hearing students and also international students whose English may hinder their understanding, but also hearing native speaker students as well. So these are the teams. So I had experts in visualization and augmented reality, and also Center for Learning and Research in Higher Education in our university. They organize, for example, MOOCs. And MOOCs, they add hard of hearing closed captions. So they're really interested in this kind of area. And ABLE is New Zealand's only company which does closed captions. New Zealand is very behind in terms of accessibility audio-visual translation modes. So things like audio description is very hard to come by. So when theater production comes from overseas, they bring their own audio describers. So we want to really be able to contribute, training in this area. And also we had experts, programming experts, and of augmented reality, and also usability design experts. So we used questionnaire. So we wanted to design the questionnaire according to this usability angle. So we sold this project to the university by saying that university wants to be inclusive place, and they're really interested in just using digital technologies in creative way to make the place more enjoyable and enhance students' learning experience. And Auckland University has got about 33,000 students, and of that, about nearly 15% of the students are international students with varying degrees of English, and 75% of that international students are from non-English speaking countries. By the way, so through this project, I also got to talk to a disability office and really wanted to understand, how many students register with them. And they told us several interesting things. Well, first of all, the rate of hard of hearing among young population is increasing because of the use of headphones, but they don't admit it. They usually come up with their own strategies to cope with it. So they rarely register with the disability service, and they said that's a huge problem because students do have issues, can't hear lectures, etc. But anyway, in this conversation, they pointed out the most successful accessibility tool or method they implemented in university was in this picture. What do you think was that implementation?
Closing the door.
Red button, that red button, yeah. So, people who cannot use hands or can do it with elbow, or if you're carrying 2 coffees, you can open the door by pressing that red button. So they said this is one of those technologies which was intended to be certain people with disabilities, but actually used by everyone. And I'm noticing as colleagues, they don't need to use it, but they use it. Just become lazy to open the door, they just press the button. So it's human behavior is really interesting. So this is the goggle that we use. This is Microsoft's product. It's called Hololens. And we wanted to really see how users respond to captions projected through this augmented reality. So it's a very much holographic image. I'm going to show you some video capture of this. So this is a user study setup happening. So to do this study, we used our high quality recorded video, which is actually our MOOCs course. You're familiar with MOOCs? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So our university produces this, so we had this. So because we had captions already made up, closed captions, so we checked with the expert company Able. They said yes, they were acceptable quality, so we used that. And we tried with different conditions, just normal subtitles and wearing these goggles and no subtitles at all. And just to show you how it feels like, it looks like from viewer's point of view.
Oh, it also went to the left,
so
just like what it did for me.
So the captions are floating in the midair like this.
And
it's
always does Doris one have the latest version of the app?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, it's always, when I try it, it's just moving more to the left.
And you can use hand,
have I got it on tilt, like crooked to the left or something?
I don't think so. I think you have the on
okay.
right. Yeah.
Okay.
When you say record, you record from our perspective or from that camera up there?
Silly thing. Do what I want you to do. It's funny, when I put the hand closer, it goes to the left, and when I do it, no, not now.
I'm just recording that.
So you get the idea. So it's a very different feel to it. But the interesting thing I discovered for myself was this. So when I was playing with this HoloLens, I felt, this would be actually interesting for subtitlers to use it. And they can walk around the screen and use hand gesture to decide the positioning of captions. And you can go up, up, down, down, shrink, shrink. And it's a just new way of working with subtitles. It's very kind of physical. It's almost like a building, because one of the applications of this HoloLens is precisely that. They want architects to use it. So instead of writing on a paper, they use computer these days, but they actually walk around this holographic 3D image and physically kind of changing the design of staircases, etc. And why not subtitles do this? And then subtitles become very much part of the aesthetics and diegetic dimension of the whole film. And it just really opens up very, very interesting new possibilities. And when we tested with students, after we did our studies, we showed them various different things they can do. Initially, when we were doing testing, we fixed the position. We told our testers they have to sit at the desk. But after we finished that bit, we showed them actually you can move around, you can change this. And they really love this customization dimension. And I think this is where the attraction is. So in future, this hard of hearing students come to lecture, pick up the smart glasses and put it on, and if captions are too high, they're down, up, they want to make it red, they change the color by just hand gestures, and they control it, and nobody else has to be bothered by it because they're the only ones who are looking through this. So, this personalization of education is very much one of the key issues. And if we can do this through translation, I think it's a huge contribution, really, to make. So I'm going to skip all this because I've already explained it. So now I'm coming back to this human-technology entanglement. So, okay, no, I've already talked about this as well, so I'm going to skip this. And the challenge for translator education, changing faces of professions. So, as I said, I've been designing our new courses, new degree programs in Auckland. And so we've been doing some focus group discussions with our existing cohorts of students. So we only offer at Auckland postgraduate level degrees, certificates, postgraduate certificates, diploma, masters, and onto PhD. And the interesting thing is that now, just recently in New Zealand, they started to offer what we call 180 points masters. So that's a little bit shorter than a standard master's. So this is 1.5 years. And so that means from our point of view, we have to really condense the content. So we didn't initially like it, but we decided to talk to students. And they all loved it, loved the idea, because they can finish quicker and can go quickly to the job market, so economically more viable. And they liked it very much. And as we talked to students, we really noticed this kind of pull between education and training. It's always a tricky issue because many students, in a way, want to be able to, ready to go and start working for a translation company. And so therefore very much looking for training. And when it comes to education, I'm not sure if they really understand the merit of it. So what we are going to do here is we are actually inspired by a Japanese university, Rikkyo University. What they're trying to do is really trying to show this kind of translation literacy. So they are, in their case, they are doing this for all students. Somebody mentioned liberal arts degree, and I think liberal arts is a very interesting idea. And in Japan, we had it for a long time. And there, they want to really press this translation literacy course. Because, you know, these days we're surrounded by translation. Google Translate, you know, many people use it without really knowing limitations. When you get the bad results, obviously you know it, limitation, but you don't necessarily know when to use and when not to use. So this kind of literacy education is becoming important increasingly in this day and age. And I think the same applies to students who are coming into translation for the first time. This kind of broad literacy is going to be very, very useful. And I feel that technology should be part of it, because technology is so much part of everything we do today. So I'm not promoting technophobe. I mean, sorry, really, technology is the only way. Not at all. It's just some cases, you know, that's the only way to do some things. And just knowing what technology can do really expand the scope of understanding of translation. So other things that we are trying to do now by talking to students, this idea of, you know, not wanting education as such, really training, more kind of a instant gratification kind of approach, that we decided to tweak our theory course to more kind of hot topics. Well, in effect, we are still teaching the same thing, like, you know, functionalism and some key, you know, translation theory concepts, but we are relating very much to current topics. So this kind of crisis scenarios, so that students can feel they can relate to them. So they don't actually see, you know, theory for theory's sake, but really can feel they can apply because they feel that's relevant to them. So that's one thing we're doing. And we are very much using local context. NATI, I don't know if you're familiar, but in Australasia region, this is a very well established Australian national accreditation authority of translators and interpreters, a very well designed framework. I'm sure that Judy will agree. Were you critical? So we actually managed to get endorsement from NATI for courses, and obviously not new one, but the existing one, which we are basing our new courses. And also we are introducing things like community management in disaster scenarios. So when you start working in these fields such as crisis translation, you realize that there are a lot graduates of translation studies can do in these kind of scenarios, not necessarily working as translators, but actually community manager, who really is such an advantaged position if you know implications of different languages and cultures. So these are the kind of roles that some of our graduates could possibly take after graduation. And we are very much implementing this Asia-Pacific perspectives on translation. So for example, a whole national foundation document in New Zealand, Treaty of Waitangi, is based on translation, between Maori and English. So all translation studies students in New Zealand should know at least something about this. It wasn't the case before, so we are really stressing this kind of basic understanding. We heard wonderful lectures about Indian traditions. So even though New Zealand is a very young country, we could do something to show our students our traditions as well. Okay, so coming back to these challenges. Many scholars are concerned about the way things are, for example, with technology. I talked about this risk of de-skilling because of this over-reliance on technologies in some cases. And I know this as a fact that my friend, who is a senior translator in a translation company, and he observes these new translators coming to work for them, they no longer kind of have this notion or even desire to want to read the whole text as a whole. They're quite happy to sit in front of Trados, translation memory, and see segment by segment, and just quite happy to just close the job and don't really question the importance of context, etc. So he is very concerned, and we as trainers are also very concerned about this kind of blind faith type of approaches some new students may be developing. And as I mentioned before, we must be mindful that some situations may require translators to work without any tools. And one of the interesting things came out from our Canterbury earthquake in New Zealand was that community translators and interpreters had to just really, make any ways to make things work. So, for example, this idea of town criers, this town criers sit at the corner of the street and disseminate message but shouting out, and they were using that kind of method because the mobile network was down. So, doing this in different languages. So one has to be able to just quickly come up with this kind of solutions. So this is, like adaptive problem solving. So to be able to train our students to be able to do that is a real challenge, but it would be wonderful if we could do this. And scholars such as Antonin Pym talks about we have to learn to learn and therefore become an expert learner. I mentioned a little bit about Neural MT coming into the market. One of the tricky things about Neural MT, obviously it depends on different types of texts you input or different language pairs, but quite often it produces very fluent sounding translation. So if you are asked to post-edit, it can actually require more cognitive effort. You have to really very carefully check against the source text. Whereas if output was obviously shoddy, very poorly constructed sentences, you can immediately tell this is very poor quality. So, you prepare yourself. But Neural MT can be extremely tricky in that sense. So our operating field, we train post-editors as well, but now the machine translation paradigm is shifting from statistical MT to Neural MT, then we have to change the training strategy for post-editors as well. So again, new implications for translation trainers. And I'm really interested in this auto-ethnography now, some scholars talk about. This is embodied field experience. So it's almost like keeping a diary and very much kind of subjective observation of some things. And even just, physical impression that you got from something. So really focusing on affect, not just simply cognitive dimension, but really affect. Emotional dimension is now kind of accepted as a valid areas of observation. So as part of our crisis translation training, we started to get students to keep reflective journal, reflective diary. After each lecture, students have to keep this reflective diary. We give very simple pointers, but it has proved to be very, very effective sharing their kind of thinking process, especially dealing with this new way of looking at translation. And what's more, we as lecturers started to keep our diary as well, reflective diary. Gosh, today's lecture went so badly, and etc. I should have done this, I shouldn't have done that. And then we share, when we co-taught, we shared that amongst ourselves. And we found this really generate very rich materials to reflect on what went on. And especially when you compare that with students' diary, it's really very interesting. Yeah, triangulation. Okay, so I'm just very quickly finishing up. How much time do I have, if any?
If we want some Q&A pretty quick. Yeah.
Okay, all right, okay. So these numbers already published. This is a very well quoted figures that how job market is going to drastically change. And I was really interested in this book by Susskind and Susskind. I don't know if any of you read this book. I had read Richard Suskind's book before about future of law, how legal profession is going to change because of information technology. This was 1990s. So now this book talks about different kind of changes of professions. And one of the interesting things they talk about is this, the communities of experience model. So this actually refers to users of professional services. And as a result of it, they really learn something in a quite deep way. So for example, if you have a particular disease, then you become quite an expert about medication and that particular part of your body, and their expertise can be extremely valuable contribution to that professional area, because doctors don't necessarily know how patients actually feel after they take this medication. So when you look at internet, they are full of websites like this that people exchange their opinions. So they talk about this type of sort of pseudo experts, users, but they become somewhat expert, can contribute to a given profession. And I think translation field can look into this, and especially I talked about this non-professional translation, and there are some ways to plug in this fan translators, particularly fields such as game localization. It can be done very profitably. Okay, so finally, just because this is US based, I just wanted to say something about AI versus HR. So artificial intelligence versus human intelligence. So when Barack Obama was elected as the president, so many years ago, he was asked, what do you think is the personal quality required for the Supreme Court judge? Do you know the answer? He thought about it. This is not an easy question to answer. And his answer, so nobody knows, really? Empathy. Empathy. This answer was very controversial. Some people didn't like it. But I like it. And I think this is something that distinguishes between HR and AI. That's it. Thank you.